Analogy.
Noun. A comparison between two things, typically for the purpose of explanation or clarification. An analogy between the workings of nature and those of human societies. A correspondence or partial similarity. The syndrome is called deep dysgraphia because of its analogy to deep dyslexia. A thing which is comparable to something else in significant respects. Works of art were seen as an analogy for works of nature. What is an example of an analogy? An analogy is saying something is like something else to make some sort of explanatory point. For example, life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're gonna get. You can use metaphors and similes when creating an analogy. A simile is a type of metaphor. What are good analogies? Good analogies are familiar. They express an abstract idea in terms of a familiar one. The odometer and speedometer on a car are a good analogy for a function and its derivative, because we all understand how speedometers work, but maybe not calculus. How do you identify an analogy? Tips for solving analogies. 1. The only way to become better at verbal analogies is through practice. 2. Try to determine the relationship between the first pair of words. 3. Turn the analogies into sentences. 4. Go through tough problems systematically. 5. Read all the answer choices first before making a decision. Is analogy a figure of speech? Unlike a simile or a metaphor, an analogy is not a figure of speech, though the three are often quite similar. Instead, analogies are strong rhetorical devices used to make rational arguments and support ideas by showing connections and comparisons between dissimilar things. The types of analogies. 1. Opposite analogy. Crying and laughing are the example of opposite analogies, as these two words are opposite in terms of meaning. 2. Object and classification analogy. Objects can be classified in the group. A same object can be classified in different groups. For example, knife and weapon, knife and kitchenware. 3. Object and related object analogy. Plant and seed is the example of object and related object analogies. Both are related to each other. 4. Cause and effect analogy. Fire and burn, read and learn are the examples of cause and effect analogies, where two things are related with each other in terms of cause and effect. One is the cause and the other one is the consequences of the cause. 5. Degrees of a characteristic analogy. This analogy mostly comprises the adjectives, but not for all cases. For example, tired and exhausted, cold and freezing. 6. Object and group analogy, where several objects together make a group, is known as object and group analogy. For example, dress and forest. 7. Problem and solution analogy. Each problem has a solution. Here two words related to each other are used in the problem and solution analogy. For example, tired and sleep. 8. Effort and result analogy. Pain and painting, write and letter are the example of the effort and result analogy, where one word represents the effort and the other one is the result. 9. Object and function analogy. Keyboard and to type is an example of object and function analogy, where one word is object and another one is the related function. 10. Performer and action analogy. In this analogy, both the performer and action are mentioned. For example, painter and paint. Word analogies. Though analogies are common tools in writing, word analogies, or verbal analogies, are more like logic puzzles. These also compare two different things, but they do it by breaking them into parts to see how they are related. A word analogy looks like this: kitten, cat, puppy, dog. What is the role of analogy? They conceptualize, communicate, and even advance their ideas and discoveries through analogies. Analogies can not only communicate and explain concepts but also identify structural similarities between domains and further scientific discovery by helping informing hypotheses. What is the purpose of analogy? Analogy is a comparison between two things. Analogies function to describe or explain one thing by examining its similarities with another thing. The two things may be very dissimilar, and the analogy forces the reader or listener to understand the connection between them.